Chapter 3 is about communications in diverse workplaces and diverse marketplaces, the quote-unquote global marketplace, meaning the idea of varying your communications based on your target audience being international, your target audience being in different parts of the country. These are all things that have to go into your decisions in terms of how to run your communications. International marketplaces and international communications, as many other things in business, brings with it positives and negatives. The positives are the opportunities for better profits, better revenue, better market share, more valued employees. In other words, you expand your markets, you can have more customers and therefore more revenue. You can have more workers if you're willing to, for example, outsource some of your programming work to places where people work for less money, like India or the Philippines or something to that effect. You can do things a lot more efficiently than if you're stuck on paying people local wages, so to speak. You can outsource things, but you can also outsource markets and get people from other countries to purchase your goods or services. So moving in the global marketplace can also mean establishing a more diverse workforce, hiring people from around the country, hiring people from around the world. That also gives you the benefit of a broader range of views and ideas. If you want to go marketing in other places, well, having people from those places in your workplace establishing some ideas can help. It could also give you a better understanding of diverse markets rather than just your own market, and of course a broader talent pool from which to recruit. If you're just recruiting from people who live 10 miles from your corporate headquarters, that's one thing, but if you're recruiting people from all over the world, you have probably a million times more possible skilled employees to recruit from. Of course, the benefits of international marketplaces and running on the international level are mitigated by the challenges, which, motivating people who you can never actually meet in person who are around the world may be a lot more difficult than motivating people with whom you can speak to on a daily basis. Fostering harmony. Can people work together, and can communication be sent, received, and properly encoded, meaning in this case interpreted or established in a way that people understand? If you write a series of directions, will it be as effective in teaching your people who work for you in Bangladesh or in Philippines or across the country or in just different parts of your own state? Will that be as effective as your communications with people who are right next to you? Then, of course, you have to watch out for cultural influences. Things like, well, obviously language, you need to know the person's language, but also nonverbal signals, facial expressions, maybe delays between communications may have one connotation in one culture and very different connotations in other cultures. Time and space issues, meaning of individual words, even within the English language, you could have words that have different contexts in different areas, and of course the rules of human relationships. What do different cultures ascribe to different things? What do handshakes mean in the United States? What do handshakes mean in China? What do handshakes mean in Europe? These are all things that are very important to understand when you're dealing with people around the world. You may have to take individual classes or individual seminars or do some research on what is appropriate in different cultures. You certainly don't want to offend anybody, especially not intentionally. Okay, what is a culture? A culture is a group of people that have specific identifiable languages, customs, or any other thing that differentiates how people live or how people communicate. It could be an ethnic group, could be a religious group, could be a professional group. These could be different cultures, and therefore that could establish that certain behaviors or certain words have different meanings to them. A big component of working with people in different areas is making sure to avoid the things that can endanger your relationships with people from different cultures. These three words are sometimes used interchangeably, but they mean three different, all dangerous concepts, but all very important to avoid. Ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism comes from the word ethnic, or it's ethno, and centric means you assume that your ethnicity or your way of doing things or your culture is central to everybody, and that everybody essentially has to follow yours. And so if you're going to judge everybody based on the same standards that you use to judge people in your own lives, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to undervalue people, you're going to overvalue people, and something that may be that you may think of as being advantageous may strike other people as being presumptuous. Assuming that everybody's going to conform to what you assume is the appropriate behavior is one danger. Another danger is xenophobia. Xenophobia is a fear of interaction with strangers and foreigners, where the idea here is to assume that there's going to be a problem because this person is from a different country, or this person is from a different religion, or this person's from a different culture, that they will automatically not work properly or may have certain deficiencies. Just because somebody lives in a particular area doesn't mean they don't have the same level of skill and the same level of adaptability as you do. And finally, something that's very related is stereotyping, which is ascribing general attributes based on a person's culture. All Asians have this characteristic. All Africans have that characteristic. All Muslims have this characteristic. These are all things that are very dangerous because they could deprive you of the opportunity to have a good business relationship if you make assumptions about the way somebody's going to behave when stereotypes may not apply to individuals. Judging individuals by their individual character and distinguishing between individuals obviously is extremely important. Okay, cultural differences are something that need to be taken into account. This is just an example of one particular dichotomy, of one particular, binary set of one against the other. Obviously, there are extreme number of nuances between different cultures, but this is just one example of a high context culture versus a low context culture. A high context culture, which means looks at formalities and looks at writing and looks at procedures more, has less emphasis on verbally communicating and more on establishing a relationship. I work for you, therefore I do what you say all the time. A low context culture are a little bit less formal. They deal with more verbal communication, and the goal is to exchange information rather than just to say I'm your superior and therefore I do whatever you say. There are also legal differences in laws in different countries. I mean, just to give you an extreme example, under communism in the USSR, it was a crime to speculate. If you bought a property for the purpose of reselling it at a higher price, that was a crime and can end you up in jail for years. Now, that obviously is an extreme example, but you could have legal differences in different countries, whereas in one country something might be a good idea and laudable and the sort of thing that you try to do. Other countries it might be a crime. Whereas you're probably not going to do business in a place that looks at speculation as a felony. There may be certain things like maybe giving gifts in some cultures might be considered bribery, and in other countries it might be considered polite. So it's the sort of thing that you do want to research and make sure that you don't offend people in their culture by doing things that are culturally insensitive. That means sending and receiving messages without judging. Just because somebody said something that you think is inappropriate or that would be inappropriate in your culture doesn't mean that they intended it to be that way. Obviously, you want to try to make sure that you deal with people in other cultures appropriately, but also if people don't deal with you appropriately because they didn't do their research, don't assume that it's a character flaw. Assume, okay, maybe they just didn't do enough research on your culture. So you don't want to get into that situation with other people, but if other people can get into that situation with you, you might want to withhold judgment. If you don't deal with somebody because they did something that would be disrespectful in your culture, you may be losing out on a customer base or on a good or service that, that could really help your business. There, of course, are also social differences between people in different cultures, how they use manners, concepts of time. Is being 5 minutes late considered rude? In some cultures, being 5 minutes late is considered appropriate. It's considered to show that your time is valuable. In other cultures, being 5 minutes late is saying that you don't think my time is valuable, and it's considered very rude. Well, you need to realize that even within cultures, you need to realize that there are individual differences, and there are company differences, and there are differences in how people deal with things, and realizing that just because they did something that you would normally consider offensive doesn't mean they meant it to be offensive, or anything to that effect. Rules and statuses. Is somebody who is an underling supposed to criticize the boss's idea? Well, some cultures may say that's fine, and the free exchange of ideas, and some cultures may consider that, practically heretical. Though these are all differences that you need to be aware of. There's nonverbal differences, And some, again, there are a lot of these things that were in some cultures it could be considered polite, and in some cultures it could be considered offensive. You know, touching, for example, in the United States, touching is kind of frowned upon, except for handshaking, I guess. But where in some cultures, hugging when you first meet might be appropriate. In other cultures, it might be considered offensive. So you have to kind of do some research in terms of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. I guess in general, if you're really not sure, the kind of more of a hands-off approach, more of a keep your distance approach, probably is not going to hurt you as much as a hands-on approach, so to speak. Posture, formality, how do you address people? Do you address people always as sir and ma'am, Mr. and Ms., or do you address people by their first names? Again, that could very, very much be a difference in culture in terms of what they considered appropriate and effective. Age differences. There are cultures that value youth and cultures that value age and seniority. Obviously, most cultures probably have some combination thereof, but you do want to make sure that you realize that where playing up your experience might be a better idea, whereas in certain other areas it might be a better idea to play up your youth. So that also applies to industries. When you're talking about something like marketing on Facebook, maybe playing up your youth is a good idea. When you're talking about administration or production or something like that, maybe playing up your experience is a better idea. It could be the sort of thing where it's not just a matter of rudeness or not rudeness, but it's a question of whether the people think that you are appropriate for them. Gender differences, in the United States business world tend to be pretty almost non-existent, where the idea is that you're supposed to treat men and women pretty much the same in the context of business. That might not necessarily be the same when you're talking about other cultures. Other cultures may insist or expect men to treat women differently than they would treat men in terms of business. Gender representation in management roles. Again, the default rule, certainly the American idea, is that you should not assume anything with regard to gender. You certainly shouldn't assume that a boss is, the man is the boss or anything like that. But then again, other cultures may look at it differently, and it's the sort of thing that even if it offends you, you should try to realize that the other person may be coming from a different point of view and try not to, to be offended. There are also religious differences. There are between people that could cause different cultural differences and expectation differences between groups of ability differences may have nothing to do with culture, but have to be looked at nonetheless. Are some people smarter than others? Well, obviously some people are going to be smarter than others, and how smart they are and how able they are to grasp your ideas has to influence your communication. Ideally, you may say it's the best idea to treat everybody equally, but if somebody's very intelligent and you have another person who's not as intelligent, you shouldn't say that. You shouldn't be rude about it, but you should realize that you may have to break things down more and use less technical terms for people who may not have the same ability in this area. And that doesn't even necessarily mean a matter of intelligence. If you're a scientist and you're speaking to another scientist, or you're a doctor and speaking to another doctor, you're going to speak in one way, whereas if you're speaking to a patient or a layperson or an industry person, you're going to be speaking differently. Adapting to any business culture is obviously important. This applies to dealing with foreigners, but it also applies to dealing with people from other companies and other religions and other races and other states even. Be aware of your own biases. What do you expect? Biases are not necessarily terrible things. Everybody's got biases. I don't think there's any way to rid ourselves completely of all biases. Be careful about applying the quote-unquote golden rule, which is the famous dictum of do unto others what you would have them do unto you. Tolerance, flexibility, respect, all these patience, all these things can really kind of get you through stressful situations. People will rarely take offense to you for being too nice or too flexible or too tolerant. The other way, obviously, is a lot more risky. How can going in with an attitude that all of these things exist can kind of be a really good starting point to understanding everybody, understanding that people are different individually, understanding that everybody wants to be treated equally. Fundamentally, people don't want to be treated differently because of their gender, because of their race, because of whatever it is. Respecting people's privacy and personal space, privacy having to do with physical but also electronic. Not messaging people in a manner that's too forward. Maybe the first communication, I always tell people, the first communication with somebody who you don't know should be a formal email. Dear Ms. Jones, my name is. Introduce yourself, establish yourself, formal, with a formal signature, with formal writing style, with formal grammar. It probably shouldn't be a text with sloppy grammar, or a 10-word text. Hi, I'd like to sell you this and this and that. Call me. It's too informal. It doesn't mean you can't communicate like that later on, but you don't want to establish a relationship like that. You don't want to be too forward. People might look at that as being a little too presumptuous. Like, who says I want to deal with you? Time and schedules, religion, communication style, all of these things need to be taken into account. All of these in this diagram here are ways to, or ideas for increasing your ability to deal with other people. And they're all based on the idea of making sure that you deal with people regardless of their background in a way that's most effective. Things like writing and speaking as clearly as possible, listening carefully, helping others adapt to your culture, using interpreters or translators if necessary, studying other cultures to make sure that you understand what's offensive to them and what's not, respecting style preferences. All of these are useful across the board. They're useful with people in your culture, and they're useful across cultures. Even if you may not be able to pick up on all the habits of this particular culture, being a good listener, speaking clearly, writing clearly, are things that are going to help you relate to anybody in all situations. How can you study other cultures? How can you? Well, you can look at websites, books, print media, and pretty much anything. Music, I guess. Listening to their music helps you adapt to their culture. Again, you're not going to do it for one customer. You're not going to start listening to Indian music on the radio all the time. But poking around on some websites and seeing what the information is out there, virtually any information you need. Having a little bit of understanding of what their background is will go a long way. Well, especially if people realize that you've done some research on their culture, they'll respect you, and they'll know that you're serious about dealing with them. Why study other languages? English is becoming a fairly commonplace language throughout the world, assuming that you speak English. Most business people in major areas do speak English, but still, if you're dealing heavily with a Chinese company, learning to speak a little bit of Mandarin, or learning to speak a little bit of whatever language of the people that you're dealing with, certainly at the very least, shows your seriousness about dealing with them. Even if you're not necessarily going to spend the time and effort to learn how to speak the language completely, but common phrases for everyday business and social situations. If you're on a business trip to China, if you won't speak a word of, if you're only going to speak English, and you're not going to show that you're adapting even to the most minute level, again, it may show a little bit of lack of seriousness on your part. Although, again, as I mentioned before, English has more or less become a universal language in most areas. Not in all areas, but for example, if you go to Europe on business, and you're speaking to the heads of European companies, they're probably going to speak English pretty well. Okay. Communication style. These are all things that matter. Level of directness. How direct are you being with your problems, with your issues, with your concerns? Could be definitely a cultural issue. How formal are you being in terms of dress, in terms of how you're addressing the person, in terms of your electronic communication, your media preference? How are you dealing with them? Is it by email? Is it by WhatsApp? Is it by text? Is it by formal letter? I don't know how many people communicate by formal letter anymore, but maybe some companies still have that style. Writing clearly. These are all things that help in general, but could be specifically useful as well to dealing with people from other cultures. Being brief, transitions, consequently, therefore, moreover, rather than having the reader guess as to why this sentence is after that sentence. Transitional words help you explain to the reader what one sentence has to do with the other sentences. Citing numbers and dates carefully without making sure that you're accurate, in other words. Avoiding slang, idioms. You're not going to, if you're dealing with somebody from another culture, maybe saying, I'm waiting for the green light on the project. the person might not know what that means, and the person might be too embarrassed to ask. What do you mean by the green light? They're sitting there. Imagine somebody who you're dealing with, and you say, I'm waiting for the green light on the project, and they're sitting there googling green lights, and they find out that the green light is something on a highway or whatever, and people might not know what getting the green light means. We know getting the green light means you're getting the approval, but using that with somebody from a different culture is maybe a little insensitive, because you might be putting the onus on them to try to figure out what you're talking about. Avoiding humor and references to pop culture, again, doesn't mean you can't be a little funny when you're talking to people, but certainly before you know what their humor is or what they're going to take offense to, you want to be very careful about that. Speaking and listening carefully, we've discussed that many, many times already. Being mindful of what the circumstances are, what the communication medium is, and being aware of facial expressions, handshakes, cultural norms, things like that. Speaking slowly and clearly without being condescending. That's actually a little, that can be complicated. You're dealing with somebody who maybe doesn't speak English as a first language, and you want to speak slowly and clearly, but you don't want to sound like you're talking to a third grader. You want to do both, speak slowly and clearly, but maybe not, let's put it this way. One thing I've noticed, that if you're speaking to somebody who doesn't really speak English as a first language, you don't have to raise your voice. Hi, my name, that sounds condescending. If you say, hello, my name is Stephen, you're saying it slowly, you're saying it clearly, that's a good idea. Raising your voice and, like you're talking to a child is a little condescending, even when you're talking to somebody who may not fully understand everything you say. Then there's other things that you can use to help bridge the gap between you and somebody else. Translation tools like computer translation tools. Google has a nice translation service that you can use as a base. You can even have even use interpreters, translators, etc. And of course, it's a nice thing to try to help other people understand your culture, aside from you're trying to adapt to their culture, but again, trying to avoid being condescending at the same time, or trying to avoid giving the impression that this is the only acceptable way of doing things. Okay, thank you. I'll see you in lesson 4.